Meeting called to order. The time is 6 p.m. Public portion of the meeting begins. The New Jersey Open Public Meeting Law was enacted to ensure the rights of the public to have advance notice of and to attend the meetings of public bodies at which any business affecting their interest is discussed or acted upon. In accordance with the provisions of this act, the business administrator, board secretary, has caused notice of this meeting to be published by having the date, time, and place thereof posted on the bulletin board of the municipal building, communicated to the Herald News, the Record, and filed with the clerk of the Borough of Hawthorne. Roll call, please.
Mr. Carr?
Here.
Mr. Clavijo?
Here.
Ms. Ehrentraut?
Here.
Dr. Morell?
Here.
Mr. Palouse?
Here.
Mr. Reicher?
Here.
Mr. Shortway? Mrs. Goff?
Here. Please join me for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Meeting regulations. During each regular meeting, 2 opportunities are provided for citizens to speak, to ask questions, and to make comments. During the first opportunity early on the agenda, the meeting is open to the public for the purpose of addressing items listed for approval on this agenda only. The second opportunity occurs just prior to adjournment, when citizens may address any subject matter that is pertinent to and/or directly related to the operation of the school district. Persons wishing to speak must, upon being recognized, rise, state their name, address, and subject matter. Comments and questions shall be addressed to the board president or presiding officer and shall be limited to 5 minutes per person. The board may or may not respond to issues raised by members of the public at any time, at the time they are raised, but will provide response if and when appropriate. The board asks that members of the public be courteous and mindful of the rights of other individuals when speaking. Please note that the board will not respond to comments regarding students or board employees in light of the privacy rights held by those individuals. Moreover, the board discourages comments about such individuals and will not be responsible for such comments. Members of the public who choose to speak during this public session should carefully consider their comments, since they could be held personally liable for the statements they make. Finally, please note that in accordance with district policy, the board will not officially comment on or respond to any matter mentioned unless it can confirm that the matter has first been brought to the attention of the appropriate school personnel in an attempt to resolve this issue. Publicly heard agenda items only. Seeing as there are no public comment, oath of office, appointed member of the Board of Education.
Raise your right hand. I
Marcus Taro,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
and I will bear true faith
and that I will bear true faith
and allegiance to the same
and allegiance to the same
and to the governments established in the United States
and to the governments established in the United States
and this state
and this state,
under the authority of the people,
under the authority of the people.
so help me God.
So help me God.
I
Marcus Taro,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I possess the qualifications prescribed by law
that I possess the qualifications prescribed by law
for the office of member of the Board of Education,
for the office of a member of the Board of Education,
and that I will faithfully, impartially, and justly perform
and that I will faithfully, impartially, and justly perform
all the duties of that office according to the best of my ability.
all the duties of that office according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back.
Thank you so much. Marco, I sent you a picture at a good angle. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Roll call of the incoming Board of Education.
Mr. Carr?
Here.
Mr. Clavijo?
Yes. Here.
Ms. Ehrentraut? It's just a roll call.
Here.
Dr. Morell?
Here.
Mr. Palouse?
Here.
Mr. Reicher?
Here.
Mr. Shortway?
Here.
Mr. Totaro?
Here.
Mrs. Goff?
Here. turn it over to Mr. Clavijo for the finance and administration portion.
Thank you, Madam President. Pursuant to the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Committee on Finance and Administration recommends the following resolutions. F1 on page 3, F2, F3, F4, page 4. On behalf of the committee, I so move.
Second.
Oh, these ties are very difficult for me. I think I went with Mr. Palouse last time, so I'll give it to Mr. Carr this time.
Thank you.
That's fair.
Any discussion?
So at this point, we're going to ask Ms. Ambrose to please give us an overview of the budget and just a recap of what the process is like. More than anything, for the benefit of us board members who don't necessarily do that for a living. It's every year we learn a little more, and especially when we're north, it's that's a lot to grasp. So we
Sure.
under that, please.
So when we started the budgeting process for this year, we assumed that state aid would be flat. And we added in all of the requests of what the various people needed and wanted, and that led to a very significant deficit. So we knew that we would be able to cover a significant portion of our deficit from the accumulated surplus that the state has allowed us to accumulate this year. But that still left a gap. We know that relying on a budgeted fund balance is temporary at best. So we eliminated all requests for new staff, except for where we had someone that we needed a certificate for. Gratefully, when the state aid came out on March 10th, we did get a significant increase, which helped. But we are still trying to reposition ourselves. We're looking down the road several years. We understand that in those years, as the ESSER ARP money all runs out, we're going to need to start building in other positions that we don't currently have. So to that end, we're trying today to start to carefully, deliberatively decide where we can cut things so it's not disruptive to the instruction, where we can try to realign some of our expenses if we find we can use it a little bit more efficiently. And so this budget gives us that breathing room. It gives us a year to basically see if the new era is our new normal, or if we're able to try to get some of these costs more normalized. So in years past, you've always been able to look historically, right? But the last couple of years have been so disrupted. And then this particular year has been anything but normal. We've had a spike in significant costs, especially tuition and transportation. So the hope is that with the COVID restrictions relaxing, maybe we'll be able to jointer some of the routes. Maybe we'll start to see that calm down. And if not, we do have a group of children that will be hopefully graduated in the next year or two, assuming that we don't have other legislation that puts, an extra year of combat or whatever out there. So to that end, as I said, it buys us that time. If we are successful in saving money, like on the transportation, then we also have the ability to buy that one-time purchase of a bus. The things that are so hard for us to build into a normal budget. So we are really trying to look not just at the 22-23 year. We're trying to look 3-4 years down the road, because I think personally that when the ARPS or money is gone, the need will still remain. So we were able, after the March 10th, to come to a 2% overall tax increase. I think if you look at your sheet, it's not even a full dollar more than it was last year to the homeowners, right? So last year it was $108.92 per home with an average assessment of $388.50. This year it will be $109.30, but overall it is a 2% increase to the tax levy. And then with that, as we continue to March 10th to revise all of our expenditure analysis, we're able to maintain all staff the way it is. And that gives us, again, breathing room for more naturally, maybe when somebody retires, that we can decide if we can try to realign job descriptions, maybe we can find a way to repurpose that somewhere else. But what we're trying not to do is have recurring expenses until we can really analyze where we're going to go.
Just out of curiosity, regarding the allowable surplus percentage of 4% that ends out of the 21-22 calendar year, does that have or pose any additional burden going into next year as far as going back to the 2%?
I don't think so. So I left about 3% remaining in the surplus now. And I expect at the end of this school year that we will replenish the majority of what we're taking out because we'll have extraordinary aid. We won't know what that figure is until July. And then that will be able to add back in. Anything that we don't use this year will kind of get added back in. So in the 23-24 budgeting process, we will have to appropriate that. You know, we can use a portion of it if we need to for the recurring expenditures. The hope, obviously, is that we get to a point that we can use it for a one-time big purchase or project. So we do have other reserves that the district has been able to put money into for capital as well as for maintenance. And then you know that earlier this school year, I asked you for $250,000 out of maintenance to start doing projects. We've expended and committed, say, just under $90,000 of that. I don't think that I'll be able to do all the projects we had hoped with Scott leaving and with the referendum projects from last summer taking a little longer than we thought. But I've already talked with Joe. We're going to try to make a priority list, and we're going to go to the Buildings and Grounds Committee at some point, probably in the early fall, with ideas of how to start doing that. Some of the projects that we have done included doing repointing at Washington School. We're going to do the repointing of one of the sides of the Roosevelt School. We redid the bleachers at the high school. We're redoing the gym floor at Jefferson. That hasn't been done since 1960 something. And at LMS, we did the rooftop air conditioner. So I tried to do something at every school. I'm trying to do something, obviously be watertight first. That's my goal. And then we can start doing some of the other projects that are needed.
Thank you.
Could you speak to the difference between the capital reserve and the maintenance reserve, what we can and can't use them for?
So maintenance is intended to be for not replacing filters, not the things that your budget is meant to take care of, but for maintenance like repointing, like a gym floor. Capital becomes when you really start replacing. So when we are replacing the parking lot or the, you know, if we were to do a big ceiling tile of an entire hallway, it would become more capital than just a maintenance issue. So in the budget, we do have a $200,000 request for the capital reserve withdrawal, and that will do the repaving at the high school after this summer, after all the trucks and all leave, and then also at the Jefferson School.
Thank you. And also the difference between those and the surplus, which is categorized as unassigned fund balance, right?
Yes, so if you look at I gave you actually both year ending June 2021
Yes.
and year ending June 20. So you can see the difference in the Department of Education, the state of New Jersey allowed schools last year and this year to double the amount of undesignated surplus. And I think in large part because they understood that the pandemic has caused such disruption and people have had the ability in the prior year perhaps not to spend all of the money that was budgeted, and then this year various spikes of different expenditures. So when you, like the maintenance reserve, the capital reserve, the unemployment fund have to be used specifically for those purposes. But the undesignated is just that, right? So you can use it to supplement. When we get back down to the 2%, you really can't use it at that point without commissioner approval. So this is a window that we have to be able to use that money that we put away for the benefit of the district and the community. I don't know if that answered your entire question, but the other thing I wanted to point out is on the extraordinary aid. So you see in the 1 year, in 2020, it's about half of what it was this year. And that also is a very unpredictable source of revenue. The the amount that you get, if you look at the revenue sheet that I gave you from the budget, the amount that we got this year is $1.1 million. But the amount that you're allowed to add to your surplus is the difference between that $1.1 million and what had been budgeted in that school year, which was $369,125. So the net difference is what goes into your surplus. In prior years, extraordinary aid was funded somewhere between 50 to 56, 58% on average. Last year they funded it at 90%. I don't have any guidance that that will continue. So I'm trying, if you look also at extraordinary aid on the revenue sheet, I'm trying to incrementally bring that down a little bit, the amount that we're going to rely on extraordinary aid for our current budget. So when the aid gets reduced back to a more normal level, we'll still have some benefit to that in a future year.
And because it's sitting in surplus doesn't necessarily mean that we can freely use it. It's a stringent process to tap into those funds, right?
Well, it's a budgeting process, and then if you're back down to 2%, yeah, then you need commission approval. But it's something in the budgeting process that you can. The extraordinary aid itself, forgetting all the other surplus, the extraordinary aid itself, you're allowed to appropriate in the year. So if you remember in October, I asked you for $300,000, and we did do that. Again, I would like to get to a point, ideally down the road, that we use extraordinary aid in the more unpredictable sources of revenue for specific projects or purchases, and not for the recurring expenditures.
I think that's, if I could jump in, I think that's one of the biggest things that, and we're working with Trudy and working with Cheryl, is the recurring piece of it is the concern. You don't want to get into using that money for recurring expenses because, you know, right now we were allowed to go to 4%, but once you're back to 2%, you can't use it for the reasons that we allocated, you know, some of that for our budget this year to make our budget work. But going forward, if you're at 2%, you got to be careful because it's almost like a savings account, right? If that money runs out, there's nothing there left to use. Now you have all these recurring expenses that you can't fund, right? So you know, that's why Cheryl's saying that, you know, it's good to use for one-time expenses because you can get something accomplished with that money, but not have to worry about what happens next year, right? So if you use it for a one-time expense, you know, you're able to accomplish whatever it is you're working toward or whatever the project is, but it's not an issue in the following budget year.
But this year, when we did take that extraordinary aid, I did need it for recurring expenses.
Right.
I needed it for tuition, I needed it for transportation. So that's where it's not sustainable. And that's where the concern in budgeting became. Not that we can't stand on our own for the 22-23 year, I mean, we'll be fine with the budget that's there. You know, barring any huge, huge new things. That said, it's not sustainable. It's not something that you want to keep relying on because at some point, if we don't generate a surplus, you have a double hit to your budgeting process. And state aid is equally a little unpredictable. So this year is great. We got a nice increase, as did a lot of districts, but as Dr. Morell and I were speaking about before the beginning of the meeting, you know, the districts like Jersey City that had such an enormous cut year after year, I mean, that's, I don't know how you sustain something like that. So we're trying, as I said, to look a few years down the road, not just at the one budget year.
Could you also speak to the, the expenses that we incurred this year that were not necessarily normal?
So we had about a 33% spike in out-of-district placements. That was huge. And each one of those came with, obviously, transportation need. With the bus driver shortage, transportation, I would say in a normal year, a route might be $225 a day. The last quote I got was $650 a day. It's not sustainable. It's just exhausting to try to deal with that. But I'm hoping, because we couldn't jointer a route this year. You know, they wouldn't put us on a route with a different town. But hopefully with the COVID restrictions relaxing, some of that will become available again. Of course, now we're dealing with gas prices, so I don't know that we'll see any savings there. The goal is obviously to get some children back in our district, or, you know, whether we bring them back or they graduate out. But we also had some legislation changes this year that extended the time that a special ed student is allowed, like for their comp ed and all of that. We did have a student return for that. So those were things that weren't anticipated. The other thing I will say is between the teacher shortage, that also caused on the new hiring process to be over what we originally anticipated it would be. And, you know, then into what everybody's dealt with as far as inflation and supply chain issues and all of that.
And the 2% equates to like 800,000, right? Is that the number said?
So 2% of the tax levy, I think when I first did it, it was like $863,000. We then had an adjusted tax levy because of the Chapter 44. And with the budgeted fund balance, it became like 900 and something. So that essentially the 2%, because in most every district, your revenues and your benefits make up probably 75 to 80% of most every district's total budget. So when that is growing at a rate greater than 2%, the 2% increase on the tax levy is basically allocated before you find increases in energy or extra tuition or transportation or all the other costs that have gone up.
And our revenue sources are very limited, if any, at that point, right?
Revenue is very difficult because you really rely on the tax levy. And then we are relying on extraordinary aid or the state aid or things like that vary so dramatically year to year. So it's very hard to predict with any feeling of certainty what you're going to have. So in this budgeting process, you know, we started this probably January 1st, really starting the budget. Right? We had talked it with all of the building principals and everybody in December, but state aid figures didn't come out until March 10th. So you're trying to plan and you have no idea what a large component will be. So you have to be prepared to cut. You have to be prepared to really live within the means that you have.
And this year, to get us to 2%, there were cuts that were made, right?
Well, originally we had a list of cuts that was made when we were expecting the state aid to be flat.
Mm-hmm.
When the March 10th came, we were able to add back in all of the salary lines. We kept things cut, so to speak. Like I had cut the building principals, their budgets by 5%. And I asked them to just be patient, right? Let us start at the beginning of the school year. Let us see if we can not have the dramatic increase in expenses that we had this year. And then I will obviously be able to give that back to them. But I'd rather not give it to them today and just wait and see where we are. We did have some subscriptions and some software that we felt could be better spent somewhere else. So it's more strategic than, you know, just cutting randomly or like a knee-jerk reaction.
Sure.
We're trying to just set up for down the road if we don't have to have those recurring expenses, if we can find a more efficient way to do it. So that's where the cuts, so to speak, are.
Well,
It's really to set up the future.
Yeah, and you know, I know Cheryl's talked about the future a little bit, and just to add some more information there. So, as you know, we've been provided with this ESSER money, right, this additional funding to provide some support in our schools, academic support, social emotional support for our students. That money is available this year, will be available to us next year. Beyond that, you know, once that money is no longer available, there may still be a need for some of these supports that we've used that money for. And when she talks about preparing for the future, that's something that we're starting to think about now, right? I mean, yes, we have these guidance counselors, you know, they're not reading specialists, but Orton Gillingham certified teachers working with our students, some additional BSI teachers to work with our students to support learning loss. So we have some additional things that we've added, right, to support our kids. What will happen 2 years from now? Will we still need those additional positions? Maybe not. We kind of feel like there's a chance we may still need guidance counselors or just those additional guidance counselors. So we need to start thinking about how does that look 2 years from now in our budget, right? If we're gonna add those positions are now no longer be funded by this ESSER money, how can we work now to set ourselves up 2 years from now to maybe add some of those positions into our recurring expenses within our own district budget? So, you know, when she's speaking about the future, those are the kinds of conversations that we're having this year for, not next year, but the following year. All right, so that just to give you a little more background.
Because those are potentially recurring expenses.
Correct, if we want to keep them in our district and in our budget, they become recurring expenses in our budget, yes.
You mentioned state aid came in March 10th. You also mentioned that extraordinary aid doesn't come until July. So you're budgeting in this budget an estimated number.
Correct.
And like you said, you decreased it because they increased the funding drastically, and then it already dropped last year, and we're anticipating it's gonna drop again.
It didn't drop last year. It increased last year. So in 2020, they funded it at like 58%. And then in 2021, the actual award, they funded at 90%.
Okay.
So I don't have any guidance whether they're gonna fund at 90% or 50%. I feel pretty confident with the increased costs that we've incurred, that we will be eligible for more. It's just a matter of what, I'm not saying more than what we received this year, but more, you know, costs are eligible, so.
You're guessing at a budget number that you're hoping that we get maybe, and maybe exceed that so we can have a little bit of, but if you're incorrect, right?
Correct. I feel kind of confident that it will be more than what I budgeted.
Cautiously optimistic. Is that a fair word?
But that's the entire thing. Nobody has this crystal ball. And there's so many variables that can impact how they choose to fund it.
Not the ideal way to do your P&L sheet.
No, it's not.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. When you think about it on your own daily business, right? If you have a side business and then all of a sudden that side business stops, you know, now you have to completely change your own personal budget. And now you're doing on a much greater scale, and you have to be conservative on certain numbers that you're not gonna know until after the fact. That's,
Well, after the fact.
Yeah, that's it.
We'll approve this budget in April. I mean, we'll approve it tonight to go to the county,
Right.
but then in April, we'll approve it as a district, and in July, we get that number. So,
So it's limited or non-existent guidance on the aid that you're gonna get, and then you have the variables which are out of your control, right? The out of district placement and the ECTI students. too,
plus and
right?
costs, right? All of that, correct?
Gas, so much.
So in your ideal world, extraordinary aid would be something above and beyond your budget, right? You would get that number and you could do a project, you could buy a bus, you could do something large. But when it's funding recurring expenses is where that risk comes in. The same with your budgeted fund balance. So it is, to Mr. Spirito's point, it is a savings account. It's a very limited savings account. And if you use it, it's not, I do think this year I'll be able to replenish a lot of it, but with the normal, you don't replenish that, and then if you're not generating a surplus because the budgets become more difficult to balance, you know, you leave yourself exposed to that risk. So again, if you use it, the ideal, in my personal opinion, is you use it to earmark a project. Not, you know, because then if your state aid is decreased or the funding doesn't come, you don't do the project. But it's not affecting someone's livelihood. Questions?
We appreciate the conservative approach that you're taking. At this point, I'm going on 10 years on the finance committee. It doesn't seem to be an easy year. Every year, right? It seems to be like, you know, you're always on your toes. And I shared with you that out of all, you know, all the time that I've been on the board, most of it has been enjoyable. The one instance that stands out that was not enjoyable was when we had to consider outsourcing our paraprofessionals, and that was just a grueling experience. And you know, again, just appreciate your conservative nature about you know, about how you're handling our budget and whatnot.
Thank you.
You know, especially being first year with us and COVID and just everything that's been the
It's been an interesting year.
referendum projects. I mean, you came in right in the middle of that, so
Yes.
Getting to know us, so we really do appreciate that.
Thank you.
The only other thing I would ask, you know, just for historical context, is that when we had our election in April, and some districts still have it in April, those districts, they have their budget has to be approved by the public. By moving it to November, that provides us a 2% statutory cap limit on it. So, you know, provided that we stay within that 2%, that's it does not necessarily need to be approved by the public at that point. Just wanted to point it out there. And there's some districts that are still November. I mean, they're still April, so you know, it's still a little different for them at that point. And you know, please, if there's any questions, you know, as far as the process, and one more thing, could you also speak to the audit? You know, the purpose of the audit and how it fits it into the budget process.
So, and again, your budget is done in the winter time. Your audit is usually accepted in December. So we did ours last week, which makes this also more challenging because I need these numbers to be able to go forward. The auditors come every summer or early fall. They go through, I'm going to say they probably spend a good 2.5 weeks here of going through virtually everything in my office. It's pretty extensive, but it does give the district a good feeling for the management of the finances and where we are. And the district is in a healthy perspective in that they have very healthy reserves, which is phenomenal. It just became a cash flow issue this year because we had such a spike in certain expenses. I don't know if that completely answers what you want.
Thank you. Good from my end.
Any other questions? I would just like to thank the Finance Committee. I sat on my first Finance meeting in January after I became president. I've never been on a Finance Committee before. It's very eye-opening, as Alex says, if that's not your profession. I mean, I'm a teacher by trade. Education is what I do, but the business side of it is totally foreign to me. And the fact that we, the public, don't feel these bumps in the road is a huge tribute to you and to Rick and to the administrative team. The general public doesn't know everything that goes into it, and that's because you guys do such a great job at what you're doing. And I'm very appreciative of that. You know, I agree. I worry about the ESSER appropriations. I know the positions are very necessary, especially those related to mental health and academic achievement. As someone inside of the school building, I don't think those are going to go away in the next year. So I agree, and I applaud your efforts to look into the future and how we can keep whatever we can for those. But sincerely, thank you, and thank you to Lou, who's no longer here with us. I know he served on the Finance Committee for years. I know that he was involved in the beginnings of some of this. So if he's watching, thank you to Mr. Turco. But again, huge thank you to you. The public doesn't have to feel the uncomfortable conversation piece of this because you guys shield them from that. You guys are like the mom and dad. You have uncomfortable conversations, and we don't. But we, the board, are very aware of what you guys have done, and I'm very appreciative of that. And that you know you were respectful of keeping it at that 2%. I think that was important to to the collective, and still managed to execute everything. So we're very, very grateful. And again, as your first year here, and you're killing it, Cheryl. So thank you.
Agreed.
If anybody else have any questions, comments before I? No? Roll call, please.
Mr. Clavino.
Yes.
Ms. Ehrentraut.
Yes.
Dr. Morrell.
Yes.
Mr. Palouse.
Yes.
Mr. Raisher.
Yes.
Mr. Shortway.
Yes.
Mr. Totaro.
Yes.
Mr. Carr.
Yes.
Mrs. Goff.
Yes. Thank you. Public be heard. Seeing as there are no members of the public here, we will wrap that portion of the meeting up. Motion to adjourn.
Second,
Motion.
motion, sorry.
Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Ms. Erentraum?
Yes.
Dr. Morel?
Yes.
Mr. Kalous?
Yes.
Mr. Reicher?
Yes.
Mr. Shortway?
Yes.
Mr. Tataro?
Yes.
Mr. Carr?
Yes.
Mr. Clavijo?
Yes.
Mrs. Scott?
Yes. Oh, I wanted to wish our March birthdays a happy birthday.
take a nap.
That's Mr. Spirito, and Alex, and Bruce. 3 March birthdays.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
March 10th.
Oh, yeah, you were here for a finance committee
Yeah, that's
meeting.
right,
That's right,
my
your birthday.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was my birthday.
Happy March birthdays. And welcome back, Marco.
Thank you. Appreciate
I
that.
feel like you need to raise your chair a bit, but other than that,
You know what?
you're
I
looking
was
good
all-
over there, buddy.
Spotted with it.
Must be Vic.
Next time.
Princess chair.
Is that what it was?
We good?